Everybody, and welcome to chapter 2 of the Rules Corner. I was looking for feedback from chapter 1, and the main feedback I got was speed it up because we all ran out of time. So this one will be a little bit shorter, not a whole lot shorter, but a little bit shorter. There's a little bit less to cover in starting, but some of the things become a bit more complex. As Karen said, if you have any questions throughout, would you mind putting them on the chat facility? And also, would you mind putting your microphone to mute? That way, what I'm showing on the screen never ever disappears. So with that, I'll kick off. The agenda we're going to go through, prior to every one of these sessions, I usually give a quick refresh on some key rules and important stuff, and then I get straight into the topic at hand. So the first one is fundamental rules. These are known to most people, helping those in danger, acceptance of the rules. Fair sailing is the one I like to spend a little bit of time on. It used to be called the cheating rule. It's no longer referred to as that. We often use fair sailing now to cover things like deliberate breach of the rule, deliberately not taking a penalty when you know you should, and stuff like that. So it's coming in much more common use. Avoiding collisions, another key rule. This is one of the underlying principles of our sport, that you must avoid collisions where reasonably possible. Often the protest committee will disqualify both boats if they're not satisfied that you've tried to avoid a collision. And the right-of-way boat can be penalised if there's injury or physical damage. So if there is a collision, both boats will need to show the protest committee that they tried to avoid a collision. Some key definitions: keeping clear is very simple, that the other boat can sail a course with no need to take avoiding action. The overlap right-of-way boat can change course in both directions without immediately making contact. And when it comes to starting, this becomes much more interesting because all the distances are changed. When you're sailing upwind and downwind, you're usually separated by boat lengths or boat widths. In starting, things are a lot closer. You need to be cognizant of keeping clear properly, and you need to be cognizant of how much room you need to give the other person. And room is manoeuvring promptly and in a seaman-like manner. And seaman-like includes the ambient conditions at the time. Overlapped, this is really important for starting. Most of the starting rules, or most of the starting incidents, occur around the windward leeward and overlapped boats. So it's most important that you understand overlapped. It's very simple. If you're on the same tack, you probably are either overlapped or clear astern. I won't go into too much detail about that because we spend a lot of time in that in the basic rule sessions, but I'll just show you a couple of quick instances. The key issues here are the top one, the overlap. Well, that's quite simple. It's a very obvious one, the one on the bottom left with the intervening boat. The important thing there and the example beside it is that the boat must be between the two boats in order to establish an overlap between blue and yellow. On the right-hand side there, the boats on opposite tacks are not overlapped because they're on opposite tacks. The boats that are on the same tack but 10 lengths apart are still overlapped. It doesn't matter how far apart you are. Finally, again, some variations on the overlap situation. Boats approaching a mark are covered by Rule 18 and can be overlapped even though they're on opposite tacks. Boats that are where both of them are sailing more than 90 degrees to the true wind, I stress true wind, not apparent wind, they can be overlapped. But the one on the right, they're not overlapped because only one boat is sailing greater than 90 degrees to the true wind. Tacking, this is just a very simple diagram that shows you how we view tacking from a rules perspective. And this is somebody sailing from starboard tack to port tack. They're close hauled as they start to head to wind. They're luffing until they head to wind. Then they're tacking between head to wind and when they have borne away to a close haul course. There's no requirement that your sails are set for a close hauled course. Okay, so let's get into starting, and the most important thing, I guess, about starting is the definition of start. This is the definition straight out of the rule book. Now, I'm going to try not to print the rules because I think reading the rules is quite tiresome and boring at times. But this is very important, this particular one. And this is the definition of start. And the underlined parts there are the ones which are the most important. So you must have been entirely on the pre-start side of the line. You can't be half over, you can't be a little bit over, you must be entirely on the pre-start side of the line. Then if any part of the hull or the crew or the equipment crosses the starting line in the direction of the first mark, you have started. So those examples in the diagram below show firstly the yellow boat. That's a very simple example. He approaches the starting line and he starts. The blue boat on the right, now I've jumped to an assumption here and I'm using preparatory signal P, and I'll talk about the preparatory signals in a moment, but this is a dip start, a common scenario. Now, the most important thing about a dip start is you must return entirely to the pre-start side of the line. The green boat on the leeward end of the line, that's a little bit more interesting because what's happened there is he's poked his nose over the starting line and then come back. However, as far as the racing rules are concerned, he started at position 3. That he's turned back and crossed the line again at position 5 is terribly interesting, but it's not relevant. He has started at position 3. So let's talk about preparation for start. So in preparation for the start, before you go on the water, you must read and be familiar with the sailing instructions. Common catch cry from race officers, and I believe Mr. Lowndes is on the line, so he'll attest to this. A common catch cry from race officers is if you want to hide something from the competitors, put it in the sailing instructions, as we know they never read it. Don't assume it's the same as last time. Always check for amendments to the sailing instructions and know where those amendments are posted. Critical things to look for and know are the starting procedure, the starting area, the definition of the start line, when you start, the order in which you start, what the time reference is, what the general recall procedures are, and what the preparatory signal is. So the starting procedure will be as per Rule 26 unless otherwise stated in the sailing instructions. This is your standard 5-4-1 go sequence. There are special racing such as the Sailing Champions League, teams racing, match racing, radio controlled racing, board sailing, which have other sequences which are listed in the sailing instructions and rulebook. But generally, it'll be the 5-4-1 go sequence. Pursuit racing or time starts differ across clubs. So you need to check whether you start any time after your time is displayed or any time after your time has been dropped. And they do differ. There are clubs on Sydney Harbour which have both of those scenarios in play. Make sure you know what the starting line is, which committee vessel will be used, and what end of the line it will be. For most upwind starts, it's most commonly, but not always, at the starboard end. The starting line is usually defined between 2 signals. For example, the orange flag on the committee vessel and the pin mark. Make sure you understand which signal it actually is. On many of these committee vessels, they're quite large, and it can make a difference if you're starting at the windward end. Note the starting mark definition, that is the colour and the shape. Check for distance marks, often seen as start between Mark A and Mark B, and the area between Mark B and the committee vessel is a prohibited area. We don't see that too much at Squadron, but it's certainly seen in other clubs and certainly where there's large numbers of boats starting. Note where the first mark is, note what it looks like. Sometimes the course is not known until your warning signal, so be prepared to quickly determine where the first mark is. The sailing instructions will tell you when and how the course is set, whether it's predefined courses such as windward and leeward. Sometimes the course is around set marks. Always check the time reference. This is a conversation which Karen and I are having as we speak. And that is the time that the RO will be using to set his clock. And the world sailing policy is to use GPS time, but this is only a policy. The sailing instructions may specify another time reference, such as atomic or UTC. If it's not clear, ask. Note the start sequence and the time for your class. If there are multiple classes, the order may be in the sailing instructions. It may be displayed on the start boat. Make sure you know which of these it is. Sometimes the sailing instructions allow for both. That is, as a predefined or default order, but the race officer may change that for some reason. Make sure you know what your warning signal will be. This is often a flag with a class logo or just a numeral pennant. For multiple start sequences, if you can, find out whether they'll be on a rolling sequence such as 5 or 6 minutes, or whether each start will be set individually. Also find out whether the race officer will start the sequences on a whole minute. Again, this is world sailing policy, but I stress it's just a policy, or whether he's just going to start them when he's ready. That is, that the sequence will start at 0 seconds as per the reference time. Individual recalls are usually signaled by one sound and code flag X. Sometimes a race officer may also signal OCS using radio. A general recall in a single class is fairly straightforward. Make sure you understand what happens though in a multiple start sequence. Most importantly, will the recalled class start immediately, or will it roll to the end of the total class sequence? That is, do you have to wait for all the other classes to start and then you restart? Check what preparatory signal applies and check the time reference. Let's talk about the preparatory signals. So there's a couple of pages of rules that outline these, and I thought, well, I'll try and distill them into something that's fairly simple to follow. But this is the best I could do, I'm sorry. So the table goes through the standard preparatory signals that are available in the rulebook and basically outlines what you can do. So before we talk about that, let me just flick over to this slide, which explains a couple of key concepts. The first one is the triangle. You'll hear me talk about the triangle, and this is the triangle between the ends of the starting line and the first mark. And this is used for preparatory signals, Zulu, uniform, and black. And they're covered by rules 30.2, 30.3, and 30.4. And the extensions of the line, which is basically for code flag I, but those extensions are not limited. They continue as far as the eye can see, and they're quite important to consider. So going back to this slide, what this says is that if you're sailing under code flag P, there's no restrictions less than a minute to go. At the start, you must be behind the line. If you are over the line at the start, then you must return completely behind the starting line and restart. You're allowed to dip start, but also be aware of rule 22.1, which is if you're returning to the start, then you have no rights. Now I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Code flag I, you must be behind the starting line and its extensions. And those extensions, as I said, extend a long way out. At the start, you must be behind the line. To recover, if you're OCS, you must return completely across an extension. That is, you must dip the ends, go around the ends. You're not allowed to dip start. Code flag Z you don't see too much in squadron racing. We see it a bit more in ocean racing. And basically, it's the first of the triangle rules. Less than a minute to go, you must be outside the triangle. So that means that at the 1 minute, when the prep signal is dropped, the race officer is looking for you to be inside that triangle. And if you are inside that triangle at 50 seconds to go, you will be classed as OCS. At the start, you must be behind the line. There's no restart required if you are pinged as OCS, but you will incur a penalty. And that penalty is typically a scoring penalty of 20%. That may change in the sailing instructions. They may change it to 30 or 25. Code flag U we see a lot more often these days, and it's the second of the triangle marks. Again, you must be outside the triangle within the last minute. At the start, you must be behind the line. If you are inside that triangle within a minute to go, you're disqualified and you're scored UFD. Now, if that race is restarted, that penalty is wiped and you can restart again. But then if we go to black flag, it's exactly the same as you. You still must be outside that triangle within a minute to go. You must be behind the line at the start. If you are OCS, you're scored BFD, and it's not wiped unless the race is abandoned or postponed before the start. So typically what you see in most fleet racing is that The race officer these days will start with P and go to black, or he'll start with U and go to black, depending on what he considers as the most important. So that's a little table, and I'm sure Karen can make that available somehow, just as a table in itself. So let's go on to starts generally. So here are some general statements about how the key rules apply at starts. Some rules are specifically excluded from applying at starts. Rules 18, 19, and 20 are specifically excluded from applying at a starting mark. There's no obligation to give mark room at a starting mark. While the start boat and start marks are marks of the course, Rule 18 does not apply to them. Nor are the start marks and committee vessel obstructions, and hence Rule 19 and 20 do not apply. There are no hails for room to tack or no hails for water. 18, 19, and 20 do not apply. I will talk about proper course in the different scenarios as we go through, but suffice to say at this point, there is no proper course before the starting signal. So the Rule 14 always applies. Although there's no obligation to give room at a start mark, there is an obligation to avoid a collision. This means regardless of whether you're inside, outside, windward, leeward, clear ahead or clear astern, you're required to take action to avoid a collision. It doesn't matter if, in your opinion, someone is doing the wrong thing. You must avoid them. You must not deliberately force them into a collision situation. In addition to the starting procedure rules, Rule 10, Rule 11, and Rule 12 are the most common rules at the start. Rule 10 is the port starboard rule, Rule 11 is windward leeward, and Rule 12 is clear astern. Most often it's Rule 11, the windward leeward rule. This is the one which comes up more often than not in starts. And the main reason for this is that Rule 18 doesn't apply. As I said, as a starting mark, there's no inside boat, there's only windward and leeward boats. Rule 15 is also important. And again, we see this a lot in starts. If you establish an overlap from clear astern and to leeward, you must initially give the windward boat an opportunity to keep clear. Put simply, you cannot get too close when the overlap starts. And I note that when we're starting, the closeness is much, much tighter than when you're out sailing on normal sailing legs. However, this is not a continuing obligation. If you give the windward boat the opportunity to keep clear and they do not take it promptly, they are at high risk of not keeping clear as the overlap continues. So Rule 22, not particularly well known or particularly well understood, but Rule 22.1 says, after the starting signal you're identified as OCS and you are returning to start correctly, you must keep clear of all other boats. It's fairly simple. For example, this means that if you're on starboard tack, returning to start correctly, you must keep clear of a port tack boat which is not returning to start. The separation rules do apply between you and other boats which are also returning to start correctly, but they do not apply between you and boats which have already started correctly. So Rule 22.1 simplistically is if you're OCS and coming back to start, you broadly do not have any rights. You must keep clear of everybody. Rule 22.2, I won't talk about that too much other than to say if you have to take a penalty for whatever reason, not just at the start, you must sail clear and you must keep clear while taking that penalty. Rule 22.3 concerns boats which are sailing backwards or sideways, and in particular by sailing backwards or sideways by backing the sail. If you are doing this, you must keep clear of other boats that are not sailing backwards. Note here that the rule's very specific about using a backed sail. If you're moving backwards for any other reason, such as drifting due to current or wind, then this rule does not apply. It's only for sailing backwards with a backed sail. And a simple example of this difference is often seen in dinghy starts, where a boat sails to the starting line and parks. The sails are let off until they're flogging. There may be another boat racked up behind them, but if the boat in front drifts backwards, the boat clear astern has to keep clear. Again, with dinghies, a similar situation arises when the boats are racked up side by side. The windward boat has to keep clear, even if he drifts into the leeward boat, or the leeward boat drifts into him. We'll talk a bit more about luffing and parking on the next slide. Sculling, 42.3. Sculling is repeated movements of the rudder to turn the boat. The key rule is you cannot scull to propel the boat or stop the boat moving backwards. You can, however, scull to turn the boat to close hauled, but only if you are stationary or moving slowly, and only if you are already above close hauled. It's the only time you're allowed to scull. So let's move into upwind starts. Now, what I've been doing in upwind starts, I've got this, sorry, skip the slide. So we're going to talk about luffing and parking, running the line, port tack starts, and what to do if I'm racked and stacked, I can't keep clear. So luffing and parking, as mentioned on the previous slide, has some intricacies. Let's look at some of these scenarios. Now I'm going to flick over to my little scenario system, and I'll just see if this works nicely. So we do this. So this is your standard upwind start, and this is luffing and parking, and the boats go up and park. And let me just redo that, and I'll stop it at various places. So yellow is to windward, yellow has to keep clear, blue. They sail towards the starting line, and blue starts to luff. She's giving yellow initially room to keep clear, and yellow is keeping clear. They get to the starting line and they're parked. Oops, that was a mistake. Killed it too quickly. And they're parked. So at this point, yellow is the most at-risk boat and has to wait for blue to bear away before she can bear away, or has to wait for blue to bear away before she can tack. So let me now show you what happens when a few more here, when the boats actually go. So this is the same scenario, but here are the two options for yellow in waiting for blue to bear away or tacking to bear away. The boats are parked, and then yellow can either follow blue or tack away. So that's the luff and park. You see, you may luff above close hauled and park. That's perfectly allowed. Just remember that before the starting signal, there is no proper course, so you can luff head to wind if you want. Remember though that if you are the leeward boat, you are bound by rule 15 to initially give the windward boat room to keep clear. So keeping clear means you give the windward boat room to move, including putting the helm down. So just be very careful about that you can't sail too close to them and stop them keeping clear. I'll go back to the slides. So running the line, you place yourself at enormous risk. You're the windward boat and you must keep clear of all the leeward boats. So by running the line, you're lessening the distance between you and the leeward boats, and hence giving yourself less opportunity to maneuver. Port tack starts are for the very brave and very skilled. This is an extreme risk maneuver with a very low chance of success. If it fails, the cost of failure is very high, and clearly the rule which applies is rule 10. And finally, I can't keep clear because X isn't keeping clear. So this is a common scenario, and again, I will go to this guy, this one, and I'll give you a quick example of that. So here's a bunch of boats coming into the start. They're all racked up side by side with one another. I'll actually go through this scenario in much more detail. We have a problem that occurs, and then everybody raises their protest flags. And the most important thing to remember about this is that you need to hail protest and protest the boat which is immediately beside you. So yellow must protest blue, blue must protest green, and green must protest red. The protest by yellow against red will fail. So let's go back to the thing. We'll go into the next slide. So to try and summarize that from the upwind end, I've created these little diagrams where I'm trying to show the risk areas And so the red is of extreme risk, the orange is high risk, and the green is kind of low risk. And these are risks of you getting into trouble. So that's what they're intended to show. So at the boat end, the key issue which occurs is usually what's known as barging. Barging is very simple. It's the windward boats not keeping clear. Rule 11. In many cases, it involves some bullying, which is why it's generally called barging. So things to remember here are, number one, before the start signal, there's no proper course. This means that boats can luff head to wind. That means that the boats that are on the ley line can luff above that, and the boats that are below the ley line can luff up to the ley line. Secondly, Rule 18 doesn't apply, so there's no marker room at the committee boat. And thirdly, the committee boat is not an obstruction. So boats coming in from windward basically have no rights and they need to keep clear. Although this is not a tactical presentation, I'll discuss some of these zones in the areas that are of significance, which you should remember. So that red zone is an extreme risk zone. Unless you have a very clear track to the starting line, it's not a good spot to be. There are no rules which allow you to get into there if there's any other boats. The best place to go is actually where the low risk area, the light green boat is in the low risk area. That gives you the most opportunity to avoid other boats and to take whatever action you need. The boat that's coming across the starboard ley line, that might be the ideal course in the absence of any other boat, but the ideal is actually the boat below him, the lighter green boat below him. So as I said, while the ideal start track is the starboard ley line, it's actually in a medium risk zone. If you're luffed above close hauled, you enter the high risk zone and have to keep clear of the leeward boats. The textbook ideal start is when you approach the line from below the ley line. Luff very close to the start boat and close the gate on the windward boat and then bear away to start. Let me show you that. Could probably guess what's going to happen on this one. So let me just stop it here. You've got the blue boats coming in directly on the ley line for the committee vessel, and the yellow boat is below the ley line. So as we progress them further, so yellow starts luff. He's doing a nice tactical start here. He starts luff. He's giving blue lots of room to keep clear. Blue responds and starts to keep clear. Yellow completely shuts the gate, comes close to the committee vessel. Absolutely entitled to do this. He's luffing. The starting signal hasn't gone. He doesn't have a proper course. So at the starting signal, he's closed the gate. Blue's had to avoid the committee vessel and go the other way. Yellow's had quite a clever start. So that's your ideal starting scenario for the windward end. If only life was so easy and you only had two boats to worry about. So let's bring back the barging scenario and have a look at some variations on that theme. This is the one you saw before. Let's go through this a bit more slowly. So firstly, everybody is at the boat end of the line, as usual. We have some boats on the starboard ley line coming in to start, which is the blue boat, the green boat, and we have a bunch of boats below them. We have the red boat coming in from well above the ley line. And they're all converging on the committee boat as we thought. Yellow does his tactical thing, tries to close the gate. At this point, he hails to blue, blue hails to green, green hails to red, everybody hails to one another, but red doesn't respond. So green hails to blue, I can't keep clear, and the hails keep going backwards and forwards. Yellow bears away to give everybody room. That's the right thing. He's required to do that under Rule 14. As it gets a little bit closer, there's a collision. Red tanks with everybody. Red tanks with the starting boat and with green. Green tanks with blue. It's quite a messy thing, but it's not uncommon. We see this a fair bit. Protest flags are flown and everybody goes and protests. So there's a couple of things about that scenario which is important, and it comes from this setup where The red boat came out of this extreme risk zone, and as a consequence of that, he really had no rights and was breaking most of the rules, Rule 11 in particular, and caused the major problem. To a lesser extent, the boats which came out of the high risk zone above the ley line, they were also at fault, but to a slightly lesser extent, and the guy that came in below the ley line was the one that made it all happen quite nicely. So, where do we get to? Upwind and the boat end. So in summary, what was clear in the previous scenario is that red and blue were clearly pushing the limits. The outcome of the protest would typically be something like red, green and blue all broke Rule 11. Blue was unable to keep clear of yellow because green did not keep clear and would therefore be exonerated. Green did not keep clear of blue because of red and is therefore exonerated. So at the very least, red would be disqualified. But because there's a collision, the protest committee will also consider Rule 14. And they'll say, did every boat attempt to avoid a collision? So without knowing the core details, the answer is yellow is probably okay because there wasn't a collision which involved yellow. And yellow was the right-of-way boat. Blue, green and red will need to demonstrate they took some avoiding action if possible. So the key question that the protest committee will ask is, when is the time to start thinking about the time that they need to think? I've said thinking too many times. When is the time to start thinking about that? So in this diagram, it's at least at position 2, perhaps 3 at the very latest. Green and red are both above the ley line. They're both in a high risk area. Green is in the high risk zone and red is probably closer to the extreme risk zone. From the protest panel's perspective, red is most at risk and will need to demonstrate to the protest committee that she was not in breach of Rule 2 or Rule 69. So again, as I said before, Rule 2 and Rule 69 are used for deliberate breaches and gross breaches. So she will need to be able to demonstrate that, that this was not a deliberate breach and this was not a gross breach. Because,
so Howard,
yeah.
I'm just going to ask a question here. So if I'm yellow and I see this developing, but you say my protest is just going in against blue,
Yes.
Describe the situation that's coming up above them, or I just describe I'm on the lay, you know, this guy was above me.
So if yellow saw all this happening, and yellow clearly does at position 4 and starts to bear away and give everybody room, but if yellow saw this happening at, say, position 3, he could take avoiding action at that point. If yellow protests red, for example, and that's the only boat that he protests, it's likely that that protest will fail. And the reason that it will fail is that there was no collision between red and yellow. And yellow didn't need to take avoiding action to keep clear of red. That's the biggest problem that we see in these kind of scenarios. Yellow could protest blue, green and red all at the same time. And the protest committee would go, thank you, that's very nice, but we'll take it as yellow versus blue initially. Those boats that are in the middle, they should all protest. Blue should protest and green should protest. It's too risky to go into the protest room without those protests in play. It's just something that, you know, it's often seen where the protest committee may look at just the incident between yellow and red and ignore green and blue. Does that answer the question, Karen? I'll assume yes, because you've probably gone on mute again. Okay, so that's the upwind at the boat end. Let's go to the other end of the starting line, and let's have a quick chat about the pin end. So the pin end of the starting line, the situation's not too different to the boat end. Rule 18 doesn't apply, so there's no marker. There's no proper course before the start signal, so boats can luff above close hauled. So again, you've got to look at where these boats are coming in relative to the port ley line in this case. A subtle difference between this and the boat end is that after the starting signal, the proper course for a boat may be to sail above close hauled. So this is slightly different. At the boat end of the line, the proper course after the starting signal on an upwind start is typically close hauled. Very rare that it would be anything other than close hauled. At the pin end though, it can be above close hauled. And the reason is they need to sail across the starting line. So in that example there, the boat, the yellow boat, she's actually sailing her proper course at position 4, where she's shooting that line. So you need to be cognizant of that if you're starting at the pin end, lining yourself up on the port lay line and assuming you're going to be able to lock all the other boats out. That's probably tricky. Very high risk. Boats running down the line, such as the blue boats, they're most at risk of being forced over early, as they're required as the windward boats to keep clear. And of course, you've got the port tackers coming in, which always cause all sorts of interesting scenarios. So let's have a look at the pin end start. So I've tried to get everybody in this one. We'll just see how we go. So again, the setup is we've got blue and yellow approaching the pin end of the line, red's running the line. Everybody's going down to the pin end because of whatever reason. Green decides to do a port tack start, lucky them. Yellow's going to shoot the mark, absolutely allowed to do that. And so the net outcome of that is that, let me see if I can come back a couple of steps here. So at the start, red got pushed over, so she'll be classed as OCS, depending on the preparatory signal. She might need to do some stuff. Blue and yellow get good starts, and green unfortunately timed his port tack start very badly and got knocked out. So he'll go down across the fleet behind. That's your typical boat end, pin end start. Okay. So now let's have a look at downwind starts. Again, I've tried to draw the zone diagram and I've tried to get both of them together, both the top end of the line and the bottom end of the line. So in a downwind start, generally most race committees try and have the downwind start on starboard tack, but sometimes this doesn't happen. The port tack and the starboard tack scenarios are very similar. Port tack starts have the added complication of the starboard tackers. So I've used a port tack start example here because this is a little bit more interesting from a rules perspective than a starboard tack start, and perhaps a bit closer to the twilight starts that we see at the squadron. So in a downwind or reaching start, rule 11 is the critical rule. This is the windward boat must keep clear. And like all starts, there is no obligation to give macro. There is an obligation to avoid a collision. Luffing and parking typically won't happen, and nor does sculling. So proper course, I mentioned before, deserves a little bit more discussion in this context. So as we know, before the start, there's no proper course. So boats can luff head to wind. After the starting signal, however, there is a proper course. So what is a boat's proper course? Under the definition, the proper course is the course a boat chooses to sail in the absence of another boat. Sometimes a straight line to the next mark, sometimes not. Downwind starts are typically wind them up and let them loose. As a general rule, think of a downwind start as no different to sailing a downwind leg. As such, the courses boats sail downwind vary greatly and tend to relate to VMG rather than raw speed. The higher speed boats tend to tack downwind. Most boats will have a snaky kind of path. That is, they'll follow the wind pattern such that their course is not a straight line but a zigzag. Although there is no proper course before the start signal, there is after the start signal. However, the proper course is not necessarily a direct line to the next mark. A boat's proper course may not be a straight line. It's arguably the quickest course between the boat and the next mark. So this affects those boats above the ley line, which is these guys up here, especially at the windward end. And although the leeward boats cannot luff head to wind, they can probably argue they could luff to close hauled. So that's like these guys coming up through here. That is after the start, of course. So whether you think they can or cannot do this isn't really the main issue. The main issue for you up here as a windward boat is that you're required to keep clear. And if you think they're sailing too high, your only remedy is to keep clear and lodge a protest. So there are some critical problems arise around downwind starts, and these include these guys. The port tack starts often come to grief, and with those who choose to start on starboard for tactical reasons. So it's this guy here and this guy here. It's absolutely allowed within the rules. Very high risk, but it's absolutely allowed. So be prepared if you're coming across the Friday night twilight start, for example, in a nor'easter, that this is something which could occur. The other one is downwind starts where the preparatory signal is code flag P, not I, sorry, not I, U, Z or black, but where they use preparatory signal P, that can create major headaches. And the main reason for that is that these guys can dip start. And P allows for dip starts, and it's probably something we don't want at squadron. Probably most race officers probably wouldn't do it for a downwind start. They usually use code flag I. So there you go. That's the brief rundown in starting. I've gone a little bit over time. So I'll now open up to questions and discussion, and over to Karen, who needs to go off mute because we can't hear her. Alternatively, what I might do is I might open up the chat session and see if there's any questions. From Phil Burgess, assume if blue and green don't protect red, then they can be disqualified. Phil, that's quite a good question. If blue and green don't protest red, I'm guessing that's a bit of a typo, then they can be disqualified. Generally not. If what the protest panel is entitled to do is it can lodge its own protest under certain conditions, not always, but generally the answer is no, they won't be disqualified. From Rod Blounds, Howard, can you cover the start where boats are stacked up on the line, but the boat comes in from the leeward, claiming windward boats keep clear when he can't? Ah, okay. I know what you're talking about there, Rob. Let me see what I can do about that. Let's not do that one. Let's do this one. And what I'll do is I'll slow these boats down, and I'll get rid of him, and I'll get rid of him, and I'll get rid of him, and I'll get rid of him. And I'll make them go a little bit slower. And I'll bring him in late. Get rid of that, we don't need that. I'll get rid of that, we don't need that. I'll bring him in late at this point. I assume this is what you're talking about, Rob. Just jump on the text and tell me if this is not what you mean. So basically what's happening here is these boats are starting, let me see what that looks like if I start it this way. 3, 4, no, I need to bring him back, sorry. So I need to bring him back about, okay, so this is the setup. I won't go through the whole lot, but this is basically the setup I think Rob is talking about. And go to the end. What's happened here? Okay, so this is a scenario. We have a boat coming in much quicker to leeward, and he's now created this overlap here, which keeps these guys to windward. Rob, feel free to go off mute and tell me if I've got this right. Is that the kind of scenario you're looking at?
I think he's trying to ask when all of the boats are parked up on the line and someone's coming in fast to leeward with more speed, and basically they can't keep out of the way because, you know, they're not able to manoeuvre. Are they still in the wrong?
So if they're coming in, okay, let's put him in there.
Rob, I'm going to allow you to talk. So if you unmute yourself. Actually, I've got two Rob Lowndes here. I don't know how you do that.
Yeah, sorry, one's on my phone. I should turn that off.
So if you'd just like to clarify that for us, Rob, that'd be great.
How it is with a lot of particularly one design boats, all parked on the line, hardly moving, close forward or above, and the boat sneaks in from behind, from the sort of second row, sticks his bow in with the boat down the bottom of the line, and then claims for the boat to windward of him to keep clear, and claiming that he's giving him room and opportunity, when it's very hard for that boat, when he's got a whole lot of boats stacked up to windward of him, to do anything. And you get this from pretty aggressive guys who come in and sort of at the last moment will claim that, and there's a real issue in being able to keep clear.
Okay.
My feeling is you shouldn't do that, but others think differently, and so I just get your view.
Is that also the case of that's something that's really difficult to argue in the room as well? So, like, you know, how do you prove all this?
So is it this kind of scenario?
That's exactly right, Howard, yeah.
Okay. So what's occurred here is that red has established an overlap from clear astern, very close to green. He must initially give green room to keep clear. If green can't do that, tough toenails red, you've got to bear away and get away from that. But if he's come in there and green and blue and yellow are already racked up, then the obligation on red is to make sure that green at least can keep clear. Now, that said, each of these boats, green, blue and yellow, also have to be thinking the same thing, that when they go and they park on the line, and Rob, you see this in lasers all the time, right?
Yeah.
When they go and park on the line, they need to be very clear in their minds that they have to keep clear of a boat doing exactly this. There's absolutely nothing wrong with red doing this, and there's nothing wrong with red creating that situation, you know, and then calling protest, and these boats are in trouble in that particular case. So he's absolutely entitled to do that. If they can't keep clear, then green can't keep clear because of blue, blue can't keep clear because of yellow. These boats need to be cognizant of what they're doing when they come to park. And secondly, again, red needs to protest green. And if red protests green and green doesn't protest anybody else, well, it's likely that green will be disqualified and blue and yellow will get off.
Right.
Does that answer the question, Rob?
Yeah, it does. I'm trying to think. There was one rule session when you know the guy I'm thinking about, the catamaran man. His argument was your boat can't do what a boat can't do, and that's the position that one's in, really.
Well, unfortunately, unfortunately, the rules don't allow for that.
Yeah, that's what
So what the rules do allow for is Rule 14, and Rule 14 is a nice wide catch-all because it says if you put yourself in a position where you can't keep clear of something that ultimately occurs in the future, then you're probably at fault, and you need to think carefully about that kind of stuff. So the catamaran one's difficult because, you know, they maneuver in a much different way to some of these smaller boats, and the thing with lasers and many of the smaller dinghies is they don't mind if they have a little kiss and nudge every now and then. When you do this in $100,000 yachts, it gets to be a problem. But I think as a general rule, most of the time that I've been speaking to the laser sailors, most of them know and understand what happens if they find themselves in these positions. Most of them clearly, you know that they are the windward boat and they have to keep clear. This guy might not get the free beer when he gets back to the club after the race, but he hasn't broken any rules.
Right. And if he's got a boat to leeward of him, so he's sort of squeezing in with a bit of a gap there, then he's windward boat, so he's got a problem with that boat, obviously. So I think I'm answering my own question there, because he's windward boat to that.
So
boat.
This kind of scenario, let's
well,
pull this guy back up.
He's still headwind, yeah. So he shouldn't come in there if there's not room, because he's going to have trouble with the blue boat, isn't he?
Oh, so that's what you call kamikaze red in that situation, if he's going to go into there. That's a very high risk maneuver. And the reason it's a high risk maneuver is because Rule 15 doesn't apply to blue. So Rule 15 Rule 15 is you must initially give the keep clear boat room to keep clear, but not if you if the keep clear boat has put himself in that position. So if you get rights because of what you did, you must give the other boat room to keep clear initially. But if you get rights because of what he did, then you don't need to do any initially at all. And so as soon as he pokes his nose in, the thing that blue should do is do a quick luff.
Yeah.
And that would tend to shut that down.
Very helpful, thanks, Hal. I guess the issue for the green boat is, you try and keep a spot below you with some room there. Is the classic sort of starting strategy, so you can bear away on just before the gun and get some speed up. And in doing that, you're inviting the red boat to come in there and give you that hassle, aren't you?
Oh, absolutely. And I think at the beginning of this, I said, we're not going to do a tactical one, but I'm very happy to have a tactical conversation about it.
That's enough. Thanks very much for that.
All right, Howard, next question. So similar scenario, take the light blue boat away, or say we've got a boat coming in on port tacking. Port tacking boat is reaching towards a start boat and tacks into the hole and then luffs the windward boat. So when do the rights transfer? So you're coming in, you're approaching the bunch on port and you're trying to tack to leeward. You obviously want to go as close as you can to the windward boat to hold them up and keep your hole to leeward nice and big. But when do the rights transfer as you tack? Okay,
so he's kind of coming in this kind of scenario, right? Or maybe he's below that somehow, and then he's going to try and tack in under here. Get back to this guy, bring it up to here, and that kind of thing.
Yep, that's right. Okay,
so my scale's probably out. Okay, so the answer is, if you go back to one of the very early slides about tacking, that's when things start to occur. So at the moment, light blue here is a keep clear boat because he's on port tack. These guys are all on starboard tack. These guys haven't tacked, so they're deemed to be on starboard tack. So he's the keep clear boat. He needs to keep clear of all of these guys. From position 3, he starts to tack. While he's tacking, he's constrained by Rule 13 to keep clear of everybody else while he's tacking. When he goes head to wind, and this is the interesting thing which we see a lot in the match racing, when he goes head to wind, he still hasn't tacked. He's not completed his tack. At this point, he is deemed to be still on port tack for the purposes of the rules. It's only when he gets to this point, and then he's borne away to a close haul course, again, not necessarily with his sails set, but borne away to a close haul course, that he actually becomes on starboard tack. So from position 3 to position 5, he's tacking. As such, he needs to keep clear of all the other boats. Windward leeward is not, so Rule 11 is not applicable in that case. Rule 13 is applicable. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that makes it pretty clear. And yeah, one of those high risk manoeuvres, but if you pull it off well, it is a winner. Howard, from David Ross, can we just clarify, is the start signal when sailing a proper course commences or when the boat actually starts and actually crosses question. The line?
Great question. It's when the start signal goes. It's not when the boat crosses the starting line. It's really simple. It's the start signal.
The start signal.
Yeah.
Even though I'm still behind the line.
Correct, absolutely correct. And that is the example that I was trying to give. Let me see what I've got here. I'll get rid of that. Way back here, where's my pin end? Oops, it's about here, upwind, pin end. So it's this one. Let me see if I've got that scenario where he comes in from the pin. No, let me go, what have I done here? Leeward end. Here we go. Okay, so bring this one really slowly again and again. What I'll do is I'll slow him down a bit. So this is your standard pin end start. Now, this guy here, he's below the ley line. This guy here is on the ley line. In order for yellow to start, he's going to have to luff and shoot the mark. So he can't luff. So he can, right now, he can luff as much as he likes because the starting signal hasn't gone. As we get closer into here, yellow starts to luff, shoots the mark. There is still no hail here, sorry, no starting signal from the starting boat. But at this point, oops, so the starting signal is gone. Yellow's proper course from position 4 is to shoot the mark. So he's allowed to luff above that, but it is from position 4. So simply, the answer is the proper course begins at the signal, at the starting signal. For a downwind start, be very careful because the proper course may not necessarily be a straight line to the next mark. So does that answer the question?
Yes, I think that does. And doesn't time fly? Look, we've been here almost an hour, so we might wrap up on that one. Thanks, Howard. Once again, a great insight, and thank you for sharing your experience and knowledge with us. If anyone does have any questions during the week, please feel free to shoot them through to me, and I'll ask Howard and we can set it up for next week. Howard, what are we covering next week?
I think we're doing upwind, aren't we?
Upwind, yes.
Yeah.
Upwind. Okay, great. Well, look forward to seeing you all next week, and thanks very much again, Howard.
Okay, thanks, Karen.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.